Hello and welcome back to the BB Marketing Asia podcast. I'm your host, Joe Escobedo, and I'm very excited on the show today. We have Namrata Kapur, who is the head of marketing, automation, and security at IBM Asia Pacific. Thanks so much for being on the show. Really excited because today is something close to my heart. It's B2B social strategies, and I know you have a lot of experience on this. But I think the first question many people will be asking is social media really effective for B2B brands? I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Joe, and this is actually quite interesting because when people start looking at social media for B2B brand, even when you have to be very clear, what is it that you want to do in social media, right? What is it that you want to achieve? And the moment you lay down that question, you have multiple answers, you have multiple things. Am I here for pure awareness? I want people to know about my brand. Are we here as a brand to actually engage, which basically means I'm willing to go back, talk, am I here or are we here for response generation / lead generation? What is it that you want to do in B2B? And when you start looking at it from that lens, what I have realized over the past few years is the rate at which social platforms evolve, the rate at which people's interest in what they're consuming on social platform, we all are aware of that. People's attention on any kind of content is sometimes as less as 10 to 15 seconds. If they see it, if they don't like what they see, if they don't like what they hear, they're going to change. There's nothing that can stop them from changing. So when we look at what is it the B2B brands want to do on these platforms, and how far are they willing to achieve that, then what I have come to realize is possibly not all social platforms would be an ideal place for a B2B brand to be in. Does it help you create awareness? Yes, great. But what kind of awareness? Are you there on a social platform to be a brand of the masses? Are you there to create content which is engaging enough to grasp attention in 10 seconds and that's it? Your metrics are all about overall awareness, how many people clicked on my content, how many people are sharing it? Or are you there for the lead generation, which has not been very effectively used for B2B brands? When you look at what does a lead response mean, at the end of the day, for B2B brands, for technology brands, which is basically where what my legacy is, we identify these responses as somebody spending enough time to come back to our websites or downloading or consuming assets that helps them understand a bit more of the technology that we want to talk about. And for that, and then what would we do with it? Our intent is to get information, get contact details so that we can reach out and say, hey, you were interested in this content, can we talk more? So those, when you bucket it in that, I find the awareness piece and realizing that awareness has to be at a more engaging, generic, what does my brand stand for level, that can definitely work. And we've seen some amazing stories around that. Can it be used for lead gen? Yes. Has it been used very effectively? I think for very limited platforms. Something like a LinkedIn, we're seeing some really good outcomes. But otherwise, platforms like Facebook, depending upon the geography that you're in, possibly not.
Okay. No, it's a really good point. And I think it's important to understand what are you trying to achieve, because I think a lot of companies are on social media without answering that question, what are the end objective? And so they're basically just pushing out content just for the sake of it. To your point, a lot of the KPIs could be things that take place offside social media. So you mentioned visiting the web page or downloading a specific form and so on. So I think these are really important. And you talked a lot about lead gen. This is something I see a lot of B2B tech companies do, is focusing social media on particularly lead gen. So a lot of their content looks very much like product brochures and demos and download our white papers and in ebooks and webinars. What are your thoughts on this? You mentioned that many are doing it effectively. I'd love to hear what are some tips to do lead generation on B2B on social media effectively.
So we did this exercise late 2019 going into 2020, where we looked closely at the kind of content that we are pushing out specifically in the Asia market. And what we really did find was that content which is around stories, right? Which is around what somebody has done or leveraged to create a certain outcome, usually performs better. And that can remain true in any form. When you tell a story, people engage with it.
Mhm.
Vis-a-vis you saying, my product is this, download it, right? So we
Mhm.
know that that's a fact. That's what we see. So some of the pieces that we found were really engaging was when we started talking about, for example, in the case of IBM Cloud, how IBM Cloud is being used. So look at the way the storyline for social media is, right? If you look at
Mhm.
something as simple as a GIF tile in LinkedIn or even in Twitter, you're creating a tile and you start the story with XYZ company has just achieved X percentage increment in their annual revenues. And they did that by revisiting this process. They did by setting up no more at ibm.com. So the
Mhm.
storyline is not really about IBM product. It's about how our organization, how a certain organization is doing better, is achieving a certain set of roles. So customer stories, use case stories, solving a business problem. You've got developers out there, you've got technology practitioners out there who have certain business problems. Something as simple as, I am stuck in this manual task for years. It feels like it's years. I am just sitting, cutting, copying, pasting. For example, I'm an insurance claim department, and I'm doing is copying, pasting, because there's so much information. Now when you start taking at it, and we did this approach where we created small uh, comic strips. You've got these two people who are talking and saying, I can't go home for coffee, or I can't go home. They're standing at a coffee bar and they're basically saying, look, I need to head back because I have to do this kind of a manual task and it's going to take me so long. And you progress the comic strip in a 2 or 3 screens where basically at the end you say that, look, if I had automated, or if I automate it in this way, I can save 50% of my time. And then those kind of storyline, we hope, engage people to say, okay, I can relate to this. And it's something conversational without really talking about a product offering. You're talking about a business problem, and those kind of things we've found definitely works out in the market. Of course, other things that work is, do you have a sense of humor? Are you able to deliver content without really putting a brand on it or a product line on it? One of the good examples, IBM did these series of social videos where essentially there's this man who's trying to play tennis, and he's going out there and he does some shots and says, did you see what I did? Of course you didn't, because it went at speed and this is what happened and all of that. And he gives a lot of data points. Essentially the gist of it was, if I'd known all those data points, or if you as an observer know, you'll know what I did just now. And then the outcome of it is, to get analysis of all of that, you look at this particular web page from Wimbledon, which analyzes all these offerings, gives you stats about players, and at the back of it is IBM Cloud. So those kind of storylines which engage a regular person on social media is what we need. If I say I have a webinar coming up, I've seen possibly 1 or 2 clicks, and that's it. I have a webinar coming up, join me, nobody cares.
I love that example because I think it breaks away from what I think a lot of folks are doing. I think, yes, a lot of folks are getting tired of the simple kind of copy and paste webinar, but I love the two examples you gave, one of which is the comic strips, because I was going to ask you, how can you tell customer stories in a different way? Because you look at it, most traditional companies do, okay, what's the challenge? What is the impact? And so on. But I think the common strip one is, it's a different way of portraying it, still highlighting what you want to share in terms of the customer success story, but doing it in a way where it's a different format. It's a bit more lighthearted. Maybe it's easier to digest. So I personally love that example. And then the Wimbledon and the sales, the humor example. I think this is an underrated kind of skill set when it comes to B2B marketing, is creativity and humor. And so I think it's a great example. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how can brands inject humor, because I think that a lot of times they really struggle. Maybe they don't know where to start or how to incorporate it into their B2B marketing, because for B2C, it's very easier looking at consumer, but a lot of times people think B2B has to be very serious, very rational. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's essentially what we say. We are talking to the most senior level executives who are trying to make a certain level of decision. We're talking to technologists who are out there coding. They want to save time, or they just want to make their processes better. But how do we do it in a way that, you know, sets us apart from what's out there? And there are people who are doing it really well. Some of the best ways to do it would be, A is, yes, of course, can we bring in that creativity? Can we bring in some level of humor? Now, one of the things that was done for one of this was the Wimbledon, the US Open piece that IBM Cloud has done. There was another one which was done, I think, a few years back by, it was HP. They ran these series around their printer. It was a print selling printers to companies. But the way that they basically did is they spoke about why secure printing is important, and they created a character who is this in a series of videos where they created a character who's actually this person who is going to go and steal your data off your printers, and how he's going about his journey hidden. People can't see him, but he's going about his journey in certain organization, and he's pointing out, look, here's a way I can do it. I'm the wolf who's going to steal stuff. And the way that was executed, the storyline, yes, it took you can clearly see it needs production, but the way that they deliver a boring topic like printers and link it up to something which is essential, security, and they bring in an element which makes people relate to it while being aware, while still being engaged with that humorous intent. We all know about the great big iconic charging bull sculpture, which is sitting on Wall Street. So there was this piece that was done a few years back, which essentially was overnight they had a statue of a small girl placed right in front of, okay, they call this the fearless girl. Now the intent of that essentially was to talk about, and this appeared around International Women's Day. So the intent was that in a world which is perceived to be dominated by men, this fearless girl is standing because she is amongst the top contributors to what happens in Wall Street. And it's supporting gender equality. And the placement of it, the way that it was projected, it's a small girl standing in front of a big bull, but it's targeting audience, which is B2B, because these are the guys who are dealing day in, day out with large financial organizations. And just that way of slightly subtly putting in that humor along with the larger, broader message, I think that was quite strong as well. Pieces like these, and of course, often you see companies coming up with a lot of social initiatives, how certain things can help our environment. There are organizations that are working along with these large organizations. So for WWF does a lot of pieces with companies like IBM and with larger end companies. But what is the storyline behind it? And when you start putting a human element, you have to remember that on social media, it's not just about you as a brand, but how you're perceived. So one of the things that was done was, how do you tell a problem and solve it through? So in Australia, during COVID consortium was set up by IBM, which essentially helped solve a number of problems that were rising because of COVID. And that's where you put in that social element as well. So it has to be places looking at the environment. Is it creativity and humor? Is it creativity, social aspect? Is it creativity and customer stories? And how do you bring it all together and place them as the environment dictates?
Absolutely. No, I love those examples. I'm going through some of them visually so some of the folks can see. I think this was the IBM COVID consortium, and it's once again very simple, but I think it's to the point. And the other one that you talked about was the wolf. I think this is something we talked about a lot when I was at LinkedIn. It was one of my colleagues' favorite campaigns. I think he talks about it all the time. But it goes back to what you're talking about. It's this fictional character played by Christian Slater, who's like the wolf, who is like the bad guy, the villain, the guy who's trying to hack into your printers and stuff like that. But it was to a point where you could understand it. It was, I think, piggybacking off what was happening at the time, a lot of the dramas, like crime dramas that people are really into. So for me, I always get inspiration, not necessarily from other B2B companies, but like looking at what Netflix is doing, looking at what Disney Plus is doing with some of their shows and seeing, okay, how can we apply that to B2B? And I think those are some really great examples. This one, like I said, required a bit more of a production, as you mentioned. The Fearless Girl, very simple, but a very powerful message. And it goes back to what you're saying. What is the message you're standing for? So I think those are really great examples of how do you implement characters and stories into B2B, which a lot of folks really struggle with. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Absolutely, Joe. I love it that you pulled those up. It's absolutely nothing better than putting a face or a visual behind some things.
Exactly. I'm trying to follow the Joe Rogan style where you like cut to the
Brilliant, love it.
Thank you so much. Another thing I'd love to get your thoughts on is we talked about what brands should be doing. What are some of the common pitfalls? And you talked about some of them, but I'd love to hear what are some of the common challenges you're seeing or mistakes some B2B brands are making when it comes to social media.
So one of the pieces which I started was be there for the right reason. You need to be on social media because you need to be there just because everybody's there. Are you there? Why? What are you hoping to achieve? That intent, is it just awareness? Is it lead generation? Is it just that mere presence? Are you there standing behind a certain reason? Are you there only for an offering? So that when you start off with that question, I think that's one of the biggest pieces. People, either organizations want to do too much of everything, or they're
Mm,
not clear at all of what it is. It is okay to say, I want to be here for, say, a 40% awareness and a 60% lead gen. That's fine, which means your strategy then, the way you start defining where you need to be, has to come into play. If 40% is awareness, which are the platforms, and then that defines which is the kind of content you need to create on that platform. If 60% is your lead generation, again, your platform strategy changes. It would be ideal. Often, the second thing that people do is just go bang on, right? Okay, here are the top 5 platforms, we need to be there, or one of the new platforms has come up, we have to be there. For example,
mm,
Clubhouse got announced last year, and we've seen a lot of tech conversations on Clubhouse, around tech, so many other topics as well. Are you, as a B2B organization, ready to jump in there, right? When you go into any kind of external social platform, you have to have a longer, it can't be a 2 month, 6 month strategy. It has to be a year, 2 year strategy. And that's because it takes a while for you to get a following. You're there for a following, for somebody to, and that following could be just because you need that awareness, or that following could be because you need the right people who are going to come back to you and ask you offering specific questions or give you a lead. So when that happens, so you start off with, let's be very clear why we want to be there. And that's where a lot of organizations have a challenge right at the onset. Second, what kind of platforms would work for me?
mm.
And there's no one fixed combination, and not everybody is fit for Facebook, and not everybody's fixed for LinkedIn or Clubhouse or TikTok, for that matter of fact. And then finally, who's behind you? And when I say who's behind you, and that often happens in B2B organizations, that you say, oh, I'm going to get a content strategist, I'm going to get a social media strategist, and they're going to run my social media, and that's it, that I'm over. But that's not true. A
Mm.
social strategist, a social content person is going to be able to only go so as pushing very small pieces of, let's say if their only job was to push out content, after a point, if they don't have the voice of the organization behind them, that's not going to be engaging. That's not going to be what you want to stand for. So when you say who's standing behind you, is it your leadership? Is it your technology evangelists? Is it your brand and marketing team who says, no, we have to be here? Um, do you have a consensus internally which says, I will nurture thought leaders across board so that I have a sustained strategy? And often that is where we get stuck. You come up with this brilliant strategy, you say, we are
Mm.
going to do this, I'm going to push brand health, I'm going to get share of voice for my brand. Excellent, you know what you're doing there. I'm only going to be on LinkedIn because, hey, technology brands do better there. All right, okay, that's brilliant, let's do that. And then you get left, for the first few months, you have a bunch of thought leaders really given time, given interest, given, just because people have a lot of other things to deal with, you start losing those thought leaders, and that's where you get stuck. So if you can't fix those for a year and a half, 2 years to start with, you might not have the social strategy that you're looking for.
That's a really good point, and I love that because I do a lot of training, and so one of the things that's always challenging, and I'd love your thoughts on, is sustaining momentum. Because it's easy to get people excited at the very beginning. It's a new initiative, it's fun, but the real tough part is consistency, and that's the key to success many times than not. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. In your experience, what has worked, or what has been some tips in terms of getting people to sustain, to be continuous in terms of their social media engagement, their thought leadership on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. That's I would call it one of the toughest challenges in social, especially for us to be able to roll out content which is relevant, which is interesting and engaging, and which has the voice of passion behind it, which essentially means you need people who are not just cut copy pasting what you're giving to them, but they have a thought behind it. They believe in what they're pushing out, and then they can customize it, or then they can actually create content that they believe in. Which is why, as a starting point, it's always great to find, if you can find within your organization, people who are a socially aware, which means
Mm,
a, they're socially engaged, they have a voice of their own. It could be small, right? It could be they're doing it once or twice a month, but they have a practice that they follow.
mhm.
Then it becomes easier to keep them engaged. Then it becomes easier to give them some ideas that, look, here are the top 5 themes, this is what we can do. But finding people who are willing to do it on their own, it's very easy to identify, perhaps senior leaders who say, okay, where you say, I'll give you content, please post. But that's not sustainable. That's not going to take us anywhere. So you need to find those, starting right at the grassroots level, people who are themselves socially engaged. And then when you feed them fodder, they have thoughts that can, that they can write about, materialize into opinions that can go out there. And that's what creates. So as a brand, your job on social is your own brand, your company. How is it being perceived on social, say an IBM.com or an HP.com or an HP site? Or but the other piece is, what are people from your organization? How are they helping, or how are they creating the product they're talking about? So IBM Security has an amazing social presence, right? You look at some of the content that's being pushed out, both talking about the community, talking about some, giving people what they need about top security tricks, tips. But then alongside that, they've got this massive community which is out there talking about security trends, security strategies, what are they doing in the next upcoming event. So it's not just about you as an individual brand, but the kind of community that's willing to go behind you. And that starts internally. And then only once you have that internal thing, you're able to sustain and create enough engagement so that you can build out a community that's external.
Absolutely. I think the community is a real key part of it. And I think a lot of people really forget about that when they're doing social media. A lot of they think of it as a one-way communication, but I think they forget about the social and social media. I was actually looking at the IBM security example. I don't know if this will load, but it talks about the different people, the different rock stars, vice presidents, security experts all have in common, and features them. So going back to you were saying 11,000 member IBM security community, and featuring these people, featuring their voices, telling their stories, I think is a great way to bring it all together. And I think this is a wonderful example of doing that. So yeah, this is very nicely done. Like I said, short, sweet, and then it focuses on different community members. So that's something that I think a lot of people struggle with as well, is when we talk about, they always think thought leaders have to be the CEO. And I was having a conversation last week with the client, and I said, okay, that's not necessarily the case, because unless you get them on board, it's been very difficult for them to sustain it. But are there people underneath? Is anyone, going back to when you're saying passion? So I always look at
Mm-hmm.
it as like a bell curve. You'll have people on one side who are always super passionate about what they're doing on social media and will do it regardless of whether you get involved or not. You have people on the other side who maybe don't have a LinkedIn profile or haven't updated it in 10 years, which is all right, fine. And then you have the middle ground, which is people who are on the fence. They don't know where to start and things like that. But yeah, they may be keen or they may not. But that's how I've always envisioned, is that bell curve. But I think, to your point, finding those people on the other side who are already doing that and equipping them with the resources and knowledge to do it even better, amplify it, with some great advice. Awesome. Well, this has been super, super insightful. I could talk to you for hours. I really enjoyed today's conversation. So I really appreciate you sharing all your insights and experiences here today.
Likewise, Joe, and thanks for sharing. I like how you described the bell curve. I think that's absolutely bang on. The challenge for us is, how and can we move people along the bell curve, right? Can you get people there? And that will always remain the true purpose and challenge of a social strategist. How do you get that going along?
Absolutely. I agree with you wholeheartedly, because the platforms are one thing, but getting the people behind it is a whole different beast. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you bringing that up and sharing your stories. Like I said, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And to everyone watching, please feel free to share today's episode. So many practical tips if you are in B2B marketing or social media marketing that I think your peers and colleagues will definitely enjoy. So thank you guys so much.